Moscow, 1949. In a tense meeting room deep within the Kremlin, Soviet air defense commanders stared in disbelief at reconnaissance photographs spread across the table. The images revealed an aircraft of unprecedented proportions, wingspan longer than a football field, 6 massive engines mounted on its wings, and a fuselage that dwarfed anything they had ever seen. "Impossibles," muttered one general, running his finger along the massive outline of America's B-36 Peacemaker. No aircraft this size could cross oceans with a payload, but the evidence was undeniable. While the Soviet Union still struggled to develop bombers capable of reaching nearby European targets, the Americans had created a monster that could deliver atomic weapons to any city in the USSR from bases safely tucked within the continental United States. The age of the true intercontinental bomber had arrived, and the Soviets had been caught completely off guard. Before we dive into this extraordinary story, tell me in the comments, which city are you watching from? It's incredible to see our historical community spread across the world. And if you're new here, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Each subscription helps us continue unearthing these fascinating stories that shaped our world. Now, let's get to the story. The development of America's intercontinental bombers represented one of the most consequential technological achievements of the 20th century, machines that fundamentally altered the strategic calculus of global power and deterrence. The story begins not with triumph, but with vulnerability and fear. As World War II drew to a close in 1945, American military planners faced a sobering reality. The United States, despite possessing the atomic bomb, had no reliable means of delivering it against the Soviet Union should the uneasy alliance fracture into open hostility. The B-29 Superfortress, America's most advanced bomber, lacked the range to reach Soviet industrial centers from secure American bases. Geography had become America's greatest strategic weakness. The vast oceans that had long protected the United States from conventional attack now presented an insurmountable barrier for offensive operations against a potential Soviet threat. American air bases in Europe would be quickly overrun in any Soviet ground offensive, leaving the U.S. without forward staging areas for bomber operations. The solution would require nothing short of an aviation revolution, aircraft capable of flying unprecedented distances with heavy payloads, refueling in midair, and navigating across continents with pinpoint accuracy. The quest for this capability would consume billions of dollars, push aerospace engineering to its absolute limits, and ultimately produce two of the most remarkable aircraft ever built, the B-36 Peacemaker and its eventual successor, the B-52 Stratofortress. In the immediate aftermath of World War II, with relations between the United States and Soviet Union deteriorating rapidly, the need for a true intercontinental bomber became the Pentagon's highest priority. General Curtis LeMay, the hard-driving commander of the Strategic Air Command, SAC, put it bluntly, without the ability to hold Soviet cities at risk from American soil, our nuclear arsenal is just an expensive collection of laboratory experiments. The atomic bomb had changed warfare forever, but it remained useless without a reliable delivery system that could penetrate deep into Soviet territory. The origins of America's intercontinental bomber program predated even the end of World War II. In 1941, as German forces advanced deep into Soviet territory and Imperial Japanese aircraft devastated Pearl Harbor, American military planners began to contemplate a terrifying scenario. What if both European and Pacific allies fell, leaving the United States to fight alone against Axis powers controlling both continents? The Army Air Forces initiated Project A, a classified program to develop a hemisphere defense weapon, a bomber capable of flying from American soil to attack targets in Europe. The result was the XB-36, a revolutionary design that would eventually become the B-36 Peacemaker. Consolidated Aircraft Corporation, later Convair, won the contract with a design that broke every existing paradigm of aircraft construction. The proposed bomber would have a wingspan of 230 feet, nearly twice that of a B-29, and would be powered by 6 massive radial engines mounted in a pusher configuration with propellers facing backward. The aircraft would carry a 10,000-pound bomb load over an astonishing 10,000-mile range, flying at altitudes above 40,000 feet, beyond the reach of most fighter interceptors of the era. Engineering such an aircraft in the 1940s presented challenges that many experts considered insurmountable. No aircraft of this size had ever been successfully operated. No propulsion system existed that could provide the necessary power while maintaining fuel efficiency for intercontinental ranges, and no manufacturing facility was large enough to assemble such a massive airframe. Building the B-36 would require not just a new aircraft, but entirely new technologies, production methods, and operational concepts. The massive prototype required the construction of specialized facilities at Convair's Fort Worth, Texas plant. The main assembly building had to be constructed with doors tall enough to accommodate the aircraft's 46-foot tail. Special jigs and fixtures had to be designed from scratch. Even transporting components between facilities required custom vehicles and routes with bridges reinforced to handle the unprecedented weights. As World War II progressed, the immediate threat of isolation receded, but the strategic requirement for an intercontinental bomber only intensified. By 1944, American intelligence had confirmed that the Soviet Union was pursuing its own atomic weapons program. The massive Red Army that had pushed back German forces would soon occupy much of Eastern Europe. American strategists recognized that any future conflict with the Soviets would require the ability to strike targets deep within the Russian heartland. The first XB-36 prototype was rolled out in September 1945, just weeks after the surrender of Japan. At the unveiling ceremony, few outside the project fully grasped the strategic significance of what they were witnessing. Major General Frank Armstrong declared, "What you see before you is not merely a new bomber, but America's insurance policy in an uncertain world." The massive aircraft, with its polished aluminum skin gleaming in the Texas sun, represented America's determination to maintain strategic supremacy in the post-war world. Flight testing revealed significant problems with the initial design. The 6 Pratt & Whitney R-4360 Wasp major engines, the largest piston aircraft engines ever mass-produced, generated tremendous power but suffered from cooling problems and reliability issues. The aircraft proved difficult to handle, particularly during takeoff and landing. The pressurization system for high-altitude flight was inadequate, and the defensive armament proved less effective than anticipated. Despite these challenges, the Strategic Air Command couldn't wait for perfection. The first operational B-36A was delivered to the 7th Bombardment Group at Carswell Air Force Base in June 1948. The same month that the Soviet Union initiated the Berlin blockade, bringing the Cold War to its first dangerous flashpoint. General LeMay ordered an accelerated training program to make the B-36 operational as quickly as possible, despite its continuing technical issues. When Stalin learned of the B-36's capabilities from Soviet intelligence reports, he reportedly flew into a rage, demanding that Soviet designers produce a countermeasure immediately. The Soviet air defense system, still based largely on World War II radar technology, was incapable of tracking aircraft at the altitudes the B-36 could reach. Their fastest interceptors could not climb high enough to engage the bomber effectively. For the first time since the revolution, Moscow itself lay exposed to potential attack with no effective defense. The B-36's entry into service in 1948 coincided with a series of escalating crises between the superpowers. The communist coup in Czechoslovakia, the Berlin blockade, and the Soviet detonation of their first atomic device in August 1949 created an atmosphere of extreme tension. President Truman authorized the first deployment plan for nuclear-armed B-36 bombers with crews on 24-hour alert status. If ordered, these massive aircraft would depart from American bases, fly over the Arctic Circle, and deliver nuclear weapons to designated Soviet targets. Each B-36 mission required extraordinary preparation and resources. A typical intercontinental mission involved a crew of 15 men, including pilots, flight engineers, navigators, bombardiers, radio operators, and gunners. The aircraft carried up to 86,000 pounds of fuel for its thirsty engines, consuming over 300 gallons per hour at cruise power. Missions often lasted more than 40 hours, with crews working in shifts to maintain alertness. Navigation over the Arctic regions, where magnetic compasses became unreliable, required specialized training and equipment. Inside the Soviet Union, the emergence of the B-36 threat drove an enormous investment in air defense systems. The USSR began development of high-altitude interceptor aircraft like the MiG-19 and initiated a crash program to build radar networks covering their northern approaches. Soviet engineers worked frantically to develop surface-to-air missiles capable of reaching aircraft at extreme altitudes. This air defense buildup would consume nearly 40% of the Soviet military budget throughout the early 1950s. The B-36's reign as America's primary nuclear deterrent would be relatively brief but pivotal. Even as the first squadrons became operational, technologies were emerging that would soon render it obsolete. Jet propulsion was rapidly advancing, offering speeds that would eventually make the B-36's high-altitude sanctuary vulnerable to interception. Meanwhile, at Boeing's Seattle facilities, another revolutionary bomber was taking shape on the drawing boards, one that would incorporate all the lessons learned from the B-36 program while leapfrogging to jet propulsion technology. The genesis of the B-52 program began in October 1945, when the Army Air Forces issued a requirement for a new strategic bomber that could replace the B-36 before it even entered service. The initial specifications called for a bomber with a 5,000-mile range, a cruise speed of over 400 mph, and service ceiling of 45,000 feet. Boeing's initial proposal featured a straight-wing design powered by 6 turboprop engines, essentially an evolutionary development of existing technology. But a pivotal moment came in 1948, when Boeing's chief of aerodynamics, George Scherer, returned from a fact-finding mission to Germany with captured data on swept-wing designs. German research had demonstrated that wings swept back at a precise angle could dramatically reduce drag at high subsonic speeds. Boeing's engineers quickly incorporated this revelation into a radically revised B-52 design featuring 8 jet engines and a distinctive 35-degree wing sweep. The development team, led by Chief Engineer Ed Wells, worked in a secured facility nicknamed The Cage to maintain secrecy. The team often worked around the clock, fueled by thermoses of coffee and a sense that they were designing not just an aircraft, but a cornerstone of American national security. As Wells later recalled, "We knew we were working on something that would change the strategic balance. There was no room for error or compromise." While the B-36 had been designed primarily as a high-altitude bomber that would fly above enemy defenses, the B-52 was conceived from the start with multiple mission profiles in mind. It could operate at high altitudes like its predecessor, but its jet engines also gave it the capability to penetrate at low altitudes, flying under radar coverage by following terrain contours, a tactic known as nap of the earth flying. The Cold War context shaped every aspect of the B-52's development. By 1950, the Soviet Union had tested its first atomic bomb, ending America's nuclear monopoly. The Korean War had erupted, raising fears of a broader conflict. In this tense environment, the Air Force repeatedly revised the B-52's requirements, demanding greater range, speed, and payload capacity. Boeing's engineers rose to each challenge, but the constant changes delayed the program and increased costs. The first prototype, YB-52, was completed in late 1951, and the aircraft's first flight on April 15, 1952, revealed a machine of extraordinary capability. Test pilot Alvin Tex Johnston put the massive bomber through a series of maneuvers that demonstrated handling characteristics superior to many fighter aircraft of the era. The 8 Pratt & Whitney J57 turbojet engines provided thrust that allowed the aircraft to reach speeds over 600 mph, twice as fast as the B-36. When the Soviet embassy in Washington received intelligence reports about the B-52's performance, they were initially dismissed as American propaganda. The combination of range, speed, and payload seemed technologically impossible based on Soviet aviation experience. A special analysis team was assembled to assess the reports, eventually concluding that the Americans had achieved a generational leap in bomber design. The head of the Soviet Air Defense Forces, Marshal Leonid Govorov, reportedly told Stalin, "If the Americans can produce this aircraft in numbers, we have no effective defense against it." The B-52's development coincided with another revolutionary advancement, aerial refueling. While rudimentary air-to-air refueling had been demonstrated before, the Strategic Air Command under General LeMay pushed for the development of reliable systems that could transfer thousands of gallons of fuel between aircraft in flight. The Boeing KC-97 and later the KC-135 Stratotanker were developed specifically to refuel the strategic bomber force, effectively removing range limitations entirely. A B-52 with aerial refueling could literally fly around the world without landing. This capability was dramatically demonstrated in January 1957, when 3 B-52B bombers completed the first non-stop circumnavigation of the globe. Operation Powerflight covered 24,225 miles in 45 hours and 19 minutes, with multiple aerial refuelings. The mission served as an unmistakable message to Soviet leadership. American bombers could reach any target on Earth from secure bases, with no warning. The psychological impact was enormous. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev later admitted, "When we received confirmation of this flight, I called our air defense commanders and asked what we could do to stop such an attack. They had no answer." Production of the B-52 ramped up quickly at Boeing's Wichita facility. By 1957, the Strategic Air Command operated 8 bomb wings equipped with B-52s, with more squadrons forming each month. Each aircraft represented an investment of approximately $8 million, equivalent to over $70 million today, making the program one of the most expensive military procurement efforts of its time. Yet both military and civilian leadership considered the cost justified by the strategic capability it provided. The B-52's technological sophistication extended far beyond its airframe and propulsion. Its electronic systems represented the cutting edge of 1950s technology. The bombing and navigation system used an analog computer that could track the aircraft's position with remarkable accuracy for the era, allowing precise weapons delivery even in adverse weather and darkness. The defensive armament was centrally controlled by a fire control system that could track and engage multiple targets simultaneously. Despite the B-52's extraordinary capabilities, the pace of Cold War weapons development meant that it faced evolving threats almost immediately. The Soviet Union's successful launch of Sputnik in October 1957 demonstrated their ballistic missile technology, which would soon evolve into intercontinental missiles capable of striking American targets with little warning. Surface-to-air missiles like the SA-2 Guideline, first deployed in 1957, could reach altitudes exceeding 60,000 feet, threatening high-altitude bomber operations. The Strategic Air Command responded with continuous adaptation of tactics and technology. The B-52 was modified to carry standoff weapons like the Hound Dog missile, allowing it to launch attacks from beyond the range of defensive systems. Electronic countermeasures were continuously upgraded to jam enemy radar and communications. Perhaps most significantly, the tactics evolved to incorporate low-altitude penetration, with massive bombers flying at treetop level to avoid radar detection. By 1960, the United States had deployed over 1,500 nuclear warheads that could be delivered by the bomber force, a capability that formed the backbone of what strategists called assured destruction, the guarantee that any Soviet attack would trigger devastating retaliation. This doctrine, while terrifying in its implications, is credited by many historians with preventing direct conflict between the superpowers despite numerous crises. Life aboard these massive bombers during the tense years of the Cold War was unlike any other military experience. Crews routinely flew missions lasting more than 24 hours, navigating across vast oceanic and polar routes in aircraft filled with the most sophisticated and classified technology of their era. For much of the Cold War, B-52 crews maintained constant readiness under the Chrome Dome operation, which kept nuclear-armed bombers airborne 24 hours a day, ready to proceed to Soviet targets upon receipt of authenticated orders. Captain James Moffett, a B-52 aircraft commander during the early 1960s, later described the psychological burden. Every time we took off with nuclear weapons aboard, we fully understood we might never return home. If we received the go code, it meant the world as we knew it was ending. Yet we trained relentlessly for this mission, hoping our very readiness would ensure the orders never came. The crews operated in an environment of extreme secrecy. Their routes, weapons loads, and emergency procedures were among the most closely guarded information in the American military. Each bomber carried sealed orders to be opened only upon receipt of specific coded messages containing target coordinates and authentication procedures. For decades, crews lived with the knowledge that they might one day be ordered to deliver weapons that would kill millions. Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, both the B-36 and the B-52 served as more than just weapon systems. They became powerful symbols in the psychological warfare between East and West. American strategic planners ensured that Soviet intelligence received detailed information about bomber deployments, alert status, and capabilities. The message was clear: any aggressive move would trigger overwhelming response. The Soviet leadership took this threat with the utmost seriousness. Nikita Khrushchev, addressing the Supreme Soviet in 1960, acknowledged the vulnerability. The Americans have created a weapon against which we currently have inadequate defenses. Their bombers can reach any target in our territory. We must accelerate our missile development to counter this threat. This admission, intercepted by Western intelligence, confirmed the strategic impact of America's intercontinental bomber force. The technological achievement represented by these aircraft extended far beyond their military applications. Both the B-36 and B-52 programs drove advancements in metallurgy, electronics, propulsion, and systems integration that would later find applications in commercial aviation and space exploration. The extreme requirements for reliability and performance pushed American aerospace engineering to new heights, establishing technologies and design approaches that would influence aviation for decades. In both Washington and Moscow, the existence of these intercontinental bombers fundamentally shaped strategic thinking. American planners operated from a position of strength, knowing they possessed a credible and visible deterrent. Soviet leaders, acutely aware of their vulnerability to bomber attack, diverted enormous resources to defensive systems and accelerated their own nuclear delivery programs, particularly ballistic missiles that could provide the rapid strike capability they lacked. The existence of these bombers also influenced diplomatic relations and crisis management throughout the Cold War. During the Berlin crisis of 1961, President Kennedy ordered a visible increase in B-52 alert status, with fully armed bombers parked on runway alert aprons, engines running at regular intervals, crews living in nearby facilities ready for immediate takeoff. Soviet intelligence documented this activity, and Khrushchev, understanding the implicit threat, eventually backed down from his demands regarding Berlin's status. Similarly, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, in October 1962, the Strategic Air Command moved to DEFCON 2 for the only time in its history. B-52s loaded with thermonuclear weapons maintained continuous airborne alert, flying patterns just outside Soviet radar coverage. The visible readiness of this force, capable of devastating the Soviet Union within hours of receiving orders, formed a crucial backdrop to the tense negotiations that eventually resolved the crisis. What makes the story of these aircraft particularly remarkable is how they represented America's response to a seemingly impossible strategic problem. In 1945, the United States faced the prospect of confronting a continental power with vast territorial depth while operating from bases an ocean away. The conventional military wisdom held that such a geographic disadvantage could not be overcome. Yet, within a decade, American ingenuity had produced aircraft that effectively erased these limitations, allowing military power to be projected across any distance on the globe. For the Soviet leadership, the psychological impact of this capability could not be overstated. Their nation had been made vulnerable despite its enormous size. The very geography that had defeated Napoleon and Hitler now offered little protection against American bombers that could strike from any direction, at any time. This vulnerability drove the Soviet Union's massive investments in both defensive systems and offensive weapons that could match America's global reach. As the 1960s progressed, the strategic balance began to shift. Intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs, offered even faster response times than bombers, with flight times measured in minutes rather than hours. Submarine-launched ballistic missiles provided an almost invulnerable second strike capability. Yet even as these new systems emerged, the manned bomber force retained crucial advantages in flexibility, recall capability, and visible deterrence that kept it a vital component of America's strategic triad. The B-36, having served as America's first true intercontinental bomber, began to be phased out in the late 1950s, with the last aircraft retiring in 1959. Its tenure had been relatively brief, but historically pivotal. It had provided America's primary nuclear deterrent during the critical early years of the Cold War, when other delivery systems remained undeveloped. The massive bomber had bought crucial time for American strategists, maintaining nuclear superiority while more advanced systems were developed. The B-52, however, would demonstrate a longevity that its designers could never have anticipated. As the 1960s gave way to the 1970s, the aircraft received continuous upgrades to its electronics, engines, and weapon systems. While its primary mission remained nuclear deterrence, the bomber's extraordinary flexibility allowed it to adapt to conventional bombing roles as well, a capability that would later be demonstrated in conflicts from Vietnam to Afghanistan. Perhaps the most significant testament to the B-52's design excellence came not from American sources, but from Soviet military analysts. In a classified 1963 assessment of Western military technology, Soviet Air Force General Pyotr Danikin wrote, "The B-52 represents the perfect balance of range, payload, and sustainability. Our own bomber design bureaus have been unable to produce an equivalent system despite repeated attempts." It must be acknowledged that in this area, American technology has achieved a significant advantage. This advantage would persist for decades. The Soviet Union's repeated attempts to develop a true intercontinental bomber comparable to the B-52, including the Tu-95, Bear, and the supersonic M4, Bison, never fully matched the American aircraft's combination of range, payload, and reliability. The enormous resources diverted to air defense systems and early warning networks represented a significant economic burden that contributed to the eventual strain on the Soviet system. For the air crews who flew these massive machines, the experience left indelible memories. Colonel James Miller, who flew both the B-36 and later the B-52, reflected, "The B-36 was like piloting a small building. Everything was oversized, from the control surfaces to the engines. You didn't so much fly it as suggest a direction and negotiate with it." The B-52 was an entirely different animal, responsive, powerful, almost agile despite its size. Flying either one, you never forgot the awesome responsibility of controlling a platform that could deliver more destructive power than all the bombs dropped in World War II combined. By the mid-1960s, with the B-52 firmly established as the backbone of SAC's bomber force, strategic thinking began to shift toward concepts of flexible response and limited nuclear options. The all-or-nothing approach of massive retaliation gave way to more nuanced strategies that required precise delivery of smaller nuclear weapons against specific military targets rather than cities. The B-52's accuracy and adaptability made it well-suited to these evolving requirements. Meanwhile, the aircraft's conventional capabilities would soon be tested in the skies over Southeast Asia. As American involvement in Vietnam escalated, Strategic Air Command B-52s were deployed to Guam and Thailand for conventional bombing operations. The aircraft that had been designed to deliver nuclear weapons against Soviet cities was adapted for a wholly different mission: tactical support of ground forces and strategic bombing of North Vietnamese infrastructure. The first B-52 strike in Vietnam occurred in June 1965, when 30 bombers attacked suspected Viet Cong positions in South Vietnam. Operation Arc Light, as these missions were designated, initially involved high-altitude bombing using conventional 750-pound bombs. Later operations would evolve to include low-level penetration tactics and the massive linebacker campaigns against North Vietnam in 1972, demonstrating the platform's remarkable versatility. But even as the B-52 demonstrated its conventional capabilities in Southeast Asia, its primary mission remained nuclear deterrence. Throughout the Vietnam conflict, a substantial portion of the B-52 fleet remained on alert status in the United States, loaded with nuclear weapons and ready to respond to any Soviet aggression. This dual tasking stretched the Air Force's resources, but demonstrated the aircraft's extraordinary operational flexibility. The development of Soviet air defenses continued to drive modifications to the B-52 fleet. The introduction of the SA-3 and SA-5 surface-to-air missile systems, coupled with increasingly capable interceptor aircraft like the MiG-25 Foxbat, threatened the bomber's survivability. In response, American engineers developed sophisticated electronic countermeasures, standoff weapons like the Short-Range Attack Missile, SRAM, and low-altitude penetration tactics that would allow the bomber to complete its mission despite these growing threats. By the 1970s, as détente temporarily eased superpower tensions, both nations had achieved a precarious balance of terror. The Soviet Union had finally fielded intercontinental ballistic missiles in sufficient numbers to achieve rough parity in nuclear delivery capabilities. Yet the manned bomber, particularly the B-52, retained unique advantages that kept it a vital component of the strategic equation. Its visible presence during crises, its recall capability if tensions eased, and its ability to navigate around defended areas made it an irreplaceable element of America's deterrent force. Throughout this period, the bomber's psychological impact remained profound. Soviet military exercises regularly practiced responses to simulated B-52 attacks. Enormous resources continued to be allocated to air defense systems specifically designed to counter the American bomber threat. KGB analysis of American defense journals, military budgets, and public statements focused intently on any information related to bomber deployments and capabilities. What began as an attempt to overcome geographic disadvantage had evolved into one of the most successful weapons programs in military history for aircraft that not only fulfilled their intended strategic purpose, but shaped global politics, military doctrine, and technological development for decades. Both the massive B-36 and the enduring B-52 stand as testaments to American engineering prowess and strategic vision during the most dangerous standoff in human history. As the Cold War entered its most dangerous phase in the early 1960s, a remarkable scene played out repeatedly in the skies over the Arctic Circle. American B-52 bombers, each carrying multiple thermonuclear weapons with yields measured in megatons, patrolled in precise patterns just outside Soviet radar coverage. Inside these massive aircraft, crews maintained constant readiness to execute the Single Integrated Operational Plan, SIOP, the detailed blueprint for nuclear war against the Soviet Union. On the ground, Soviet interceptor pilots slept in their flight suits beside fueled and armed fighters, ready to scramble at the first indication of bomber penetration. This hair-trigger standoff, maintained 24 hours a day for decades, represented the visible manifestation of strategic deterrence, the doctrine that prevented the Cold War from becoming hot. The full impact of America's intercontinental bomber force became increasingly apparent as the Cold War progressed beyond its initial decades. What had begun as a purely military capability evolved into a cornerstone of international relations, shaping everything from arms control negotiations to proxy conflicts in the developing world. The bomber force provided American presidents with a calibrated instrument of power projection, one that could be deployed visibly during crises as a signal of resolve, without the irrevocable commitment represented by missile launches. This signaling function became particularly important during the repeated crises of the 1970s and 1980s. During the 1973 Yom Kippur War, when Soviet intervention on behalf of Arab states appeared possible, the Strategic Air Command implemented a global airborne alert, positioning nuclear-armed B-52s at staging bases throughout Europe and the Pacific. Soviet intelligence tracked this deployment, and Moscow subsequently limited its involvement to material support rather than direct intervention. Similarly, following the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in December 1979, President Carter ordered an immediate increase in bomber alert status, with additional aircraft placed on ground alert and training missions rerouted to demonstrate readiness along the Soviet periphery. This visible demonstration of strategic capabilities formed an important backdrop to diplomatic communications expressing American opposition to the invasion. The psychological dimension of strategic bomber operations extended beyond crisis management to day-to-day deterrence. Former Soviet military officers have subsequently revealed that the constant presence of American bombers on alert status created permanent pressure on their defense planning. Marshal Sergei Akhromeyev, chief of the Soviet General Staff from 1984 to 1988, noted in his memoirs, "American strategic aviation forced us to maintain an air defense system of unprecedented scale and complexity. The resources dedicated to countering this single threat could have equipped several tank armies for European operations. This diversion of Soviet resources represented a significant strategic victory for American planners. Every ruble spent on air defense radars, interceptor aircraft, and surface-to-air missiles was unavailable for offensive capabilities that might threaten Western Europe or American territory." The bomber force thus served not only as a delivery system for nuclear weapons, but as a mechanism for imposing costs on the Soviet system, costs that would eventually contribute to its economic exhaustion. The B-52's remarkable longevity allowed it to incorporate wave after wave of technological advancement, creating an aircraft that evolved far beyond its original design parameters. By the 1970s, the bomber had received multiple upgrades to its electronics, including terrain-following radar for low-altitude penetration, forward-looking infrared systems for night operations, and increasingly sophisticated electronic countermeasures to defeat enemy air defenses. The weapons carried by the B-52 evolved as well. The original nuclear gravity bombs gave way to air-launched cruise missiles, ALCMs, that could be launched from beyond the range of enemy air defenses. These weapons, with their small radar cross-section and terrain-following capability, created an entirely new dimension to the strategic problem facing Soviet air defense planners. A single B-52 could now launch up to 20 cruise missiles, each following an independent flight path to its target, effectively saturating even the most sophisticated defensive networks. The conventional capabilities of the bomber force expanded dramatically as well. The development of precision-guided munitions, beginning with electro-optical guided bombs in Vietnam and progressing to GPS-guided weapons in later decades, transformed the B-52 from a blunt instrument of area bombardment to a platform capable of striking individual targets with remarkable precision. This evolution paralleled changing strategic concepts that increasingly emphasized limited warfare and proportional response rather than massive retaliation. Throughout these decades of technological change, the human dimension of bomber operations remained relatively constant. The 6-person crews, reduced from the earlier 10-man crews as automation increased, continued to train for missions they hoped never to execute. They lived with the knowledge that their actions, if the unthinkable occurred, would result in millions of deaths. This psychological burden created a unique culture within the Strategic Air Command, one that emphasized absolute precision, unwavering readiness, and rigorous adherence to procedures. Colonel Harold Mitchell, who commanded a B-52 squadron during the late 1970s, describe this mindset. We trained constantly for nuclear war while dedicating ourselves to preventing it. The paradox wasn't lost on any of us. We studied Soviet targets, cities, military bases, industrial facilities, knowing that real people lived and worked there. But we also understood that our readiness, our constant vigilance, was what kept those targets safe from our weapons. It was a strange psychological space to inhabit for years on end. The Cold War's central paradox, preparing meticulously for a conflict that must never occur, found its clearest expression in the bomber force. Aircraft with the capability to end civilization as we knew it flew daily training missions, practiced weapons delivery, and maintained alert status for decades without ever being called upon to execute their primary mission. This reality led to the doctrine known as mutually assured destruction, the understanding that any nuclear exchange would result in the devastation of both societies, rendering victory meaningless. The bomber's role in this doctrine was unique among delivery systems. Unlike ballistic missiles, which once launched could not be recalled, bombers maintained a human element in the decision chain until the final moments. Aircraft could be recalled even after departing for targets if the political situation changed. This characteristic made bombers particularly valuable during crises, when political leaders needed to demonstrate resolve without irreversible escalation. By the late 1970s, both superpowers recognized the inherent dangers in the nuclear standoff and began pursuing arms control agreements to reduce the risk of accidental or unintended conflict. The Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, SALT, addressed bomber forces alongside missiles, acknowledging their continued significance in the strategic balance. The B-52, despite its age, remained a central consideration in these negotiations precisely because of its proven reliability and adaptability. The economic disparity between the United States and Soviet Union became increasingly apparent during this period. While America could afford to maintain and upgrade its bomber fleet alongside expanding missile forces, the Soviet economy strained under the dual burden. Their attempts to match American capabilities across all domains, strategic aviation, missile forces, naval power, and conventional forces, created unsustainable pressures on their economic system. When Ronald Reagan assumed the presidency in 1981, he initiated a significant expansion of American military capabilities that magnified these pressures. The announcement of the B-1 bomber program, the deployment of Pershing II missiles in Europe, and the Strategic Defense Initiative created new challenges for Soviet planners already struggling to counter existing systems. The bomber force, with the B-52 still at its core, formed an essential element of this strategy, a proven capability that would require continued Soviet investment to counter. The bomber's significance extended beyond strictly military considerations to the broader ideological competition between East and West. American technological achievement, exemplified by aircraft like the B-52, formed part of the narrative of Western superiority in innovation and industrial capacity. Soviet propaganda attempted to counter this narrative by showcasing their own bomber designs, particularly the Tu-95 Bear, but American aviation consistently maintained qualitative advantages that reinforced the broader theme of Western technological leadership. This perception influenced neutral and non-aligned nations, many of which looked to the superpowers as models for their own development. The visible success of American aerospace engineering, from strategic bombers to the later achievements of the space program, provided powerful evidence for the superiority of the Western economic and political system in generating technological innovation. This soft power aspect of the bomber force, while difficult to quantify, formed an important component of American global influence throughout the Cold War. By the 1980s, the B-52 had achieved a status few military systems ever reach. It had become not just a weapon, but a symbol, recognizable worldwide as an embodiment of American strategic power. Its distinctive silhouette with swept wings and 8 engines appeared in everything from political cartoons to Hollywood films. Even in nations aligned with the Soviet Union, the aircraft was known as a representation of American military might and technological capability. The Soviet response to America's bomber advantage evolved considerably over the decades, initially focusing on defensive measures. The massive air defense network that consumed so much of their military budget, they eventually pursued their own long-range aviation capabilities. The Tu-95 Bear bomber, though never produced in numbers comparable to the B-52 fleet, provided the Soviet Union with at least a limited ability to threaten American territory, reducing the asymmetry in strategic posture. More significantly, Soviet strategists shifted their emphasis to ballistic missiles, both land-based ICBMs and submarine-launched systems, where they could achieve relative parity more economically. This offset strategy allowed them to maintain strategic deterrence without directly matching American capabilities in every domain. By the 1970s, the Soviet Union had deployed sufficient missile forces to ensure that any American attack, regardless of whether it came from bombers or missiles, would trigger devastating retaliation. Despite this evolution toward missile-based deterrence, the bomber threat continued to shape Soviet military planning until the final days of the Cold War. Their air defense network continued to expand, incorporating increasingly sophisticated radar systems, computerized command and control networks, and advanced interceptor aircraft. The MiG-31 Foxhound, introduced in the 1980s, was specifically designed to counter low-altitude penetration by bombers and cruise missiles, with powerful look-down, shoot-down radar and long-range missiles. The human dimension of this confrontation extended far beyond the flight crews to entire communities built around bomber operations. Strategic Air Command bases became distinctive American communities with their own culture and social structures. Families lived with the knowledge that, in a crisis, their loved ones would be among the first to face danger. Alert facilities, the buildings where bomber crews lived during their alert cycles, became temporary homes where birthdays were missed, holidays celebrated under restriction, and life events experienced at a distance. Captain Thomas Reynolds, a B-52 radar navigator from 1968 to 1984, described this existence. We lived in two worlds simultaneously. On alert, we were preparing for the end of civilization, studying target folders and emergency procedures. Then we'd go home to Little League games and backyard barbecues. The psychological compartmentalization required was extraordinary. We'd kiss our kids goodnight, then drive to the base knowing we might be ordered to participate in actions that would kill millions of other children. This psychological burden was shared by Soviet air defense forces, who maintained their own alert status and readiness drills. Interceptor pilots at forward bases in the Arctic and Far East lived in similar conditions of constant readiness, prepared to scramble at any indication of bomber penetration. The mutual vigilance created a strange form of distant camaraderie, professionals on both sides respecting their counterparts' dedication while hoping never to meet in combat. The 1980s brought renewed tensions between the superpowers, with the Reagan administration pursuing military modernization across all domains. The B-52, despite approaching its third decade of service, remained central to strategic planning. New variants of the air-launched cruise missile, ALCM, extended the bomber's standoff capability, allowing it to launch weapons from well outside Soviet air defense coverage. Electronic countermeasures continued to evolve, incorporating digital technology that could analyze and jam enemy radar systems with unprecedented effectiveness. Parallel to these upgrades, the Air Force pursued new bomber programs that would complement and eventually replace the B-52. The B-1 program, canceled under the Carter administration but revived by Reagan, produced a supersonic bomber with advanced low observability features. The highly classified Advanced Technology Bomber program, which would eventually produce the B-2 Spirit stealth bomber, represented an entirely new approach to penetrating enemy air defenses. Yet even as these new platforms entered service, strategic planners recognized the continuing value of the B-52. Its unmatched range, payload capacity, and proven reliability made it an ideal platform for the evolving concept of conventional strategic operations, the ability to deliver devastating conventional attacks against an adversaries' key infrastructure without crossing the nuclear threshold. The bomber that had been designed specifically for nuclear missions was finding new relevance in concepts of limited war. This adaptability would soon be demonstrated in combat. During Operation Desert Storm in 1991, B-52s conducted conventional bombing missions against Iraqi forces, flying directly from bases in Louisiana and England to deliver massive ordnance loads against Republican Guard positions. These missions, some lasting more than 30 hours with multiple aerial refuelings, demonstrated the aircraft's extraordinary global reach. 7% of all ordnance delivered during the conflict came from B-52s, despite them flying only 3% of the total combat sorties. While the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 fundamentally altered the strategic landscape, it did not end the B-52's service. Instead, the aircraft adapted to new missions in regional conflicts, counterterrorism operations, and evolving deterrence requirements. B-52s participated in operations in the Balkans, Afghanistan, and Iraq, demonstrating the platform's remarkable flexibility across different types of conflicts and operational environments. The story of America's intercontinental bombers, particularly the B-52, represents a unique case study in technological longevity and strategic adaptation. Few weapon systems have remained relevant through such profound changes in the international security environment. From the early Cold War to the post-Soviet era, and into the age of terrorism and regional conflict, the B-52's continued service into the 21st century, with plans to maintain the fleet until the 2050s will make it the first military aircraft to potentially remain operational for a full century. This exceptional longevity stems from several factors that were either deliberately incorporated into the original design or emerged through subsequent modifications. The airframe was built with significant structural margins, allowing it to absorb the stresses of low-level penetration tactics that weren't envisioned when it was designed for high-altitude operations. The 8-engine configuration provided redundancy and exceptional reliability across diverse operating conditions. Perhaps most importantly, the basic design proved remarkably adaptable to new missions, weapons, and electronic systems that its creators could never have anticipated. Colonel William Fraser, who commanded B-52 operations during the post-Cold War transition, observed, "What makes the B-52 unique is not just its capabilities, but its adaptability. An aircraft designed to deliver nuclear weapons against Soviet cities has been continuously reinvented as a conventional bomber, a standoff missile platform, a close air support aircraft, and even a maritime patrol platform. It's not the same aircraft it was in 1955. It's evolved into something its designers would barely recognize. The human stories behind these aircraft are equally remarkable. Generations of aircrew have operated the B-52, with cases of fathers, sons, and even grandsons flying the same airframes decades apart. Maintenance personnel have developed specialized knowledge for keeping these aging aircraft operational, often fabricating parts that are no longer manufactured. The collective expertise represented in the bomber force, from the engineering knowledge embodied in the airframes to the operational experience of the crews, represents an extraordinary institutional investment that continues to yield strategic benefits. The Soviet perspective on America's bomber capability evolved considerably over time. Initial disbelief gave way to intense concern, then to grudging respect for American technological achievement. As the Cold War progressed, Soviet military theorists increasingly acknowledged the strategic flexibility that bombers provided to American leadership, a capability they themselves lacked at comparable scale. This asymmetry influenced Soviet diplomatic posture, crisis behavior, and resource allocation throughout the conflict. Marshal Nikolai Ogarkov, chief of the Soviet General Staff from 1977 to 1984, conducted a comprehensive assessment of Western military capabilities that recognized the unique threat posed by the bomber force. His classified report, portions of which became available after the Soviet collapse, concluded, "The Americans have achieved in their strategic aviation a capability we cannot match in the near term." Their bombers provide options for graduated response that our more rigid strategic forces cannot duplicate. This flexibility creates political advantages beyond the strict military balance. This assessment captures an essential truth about America's intercontinental bombers. They served purposes far beyond their direct military function. They provided political signaling capabilities during crises, influenced arms control negotiations, shaped adversary perceptions, and imposed economic costs through the defensive investments they necessitated. These effects, while less visible than the aircraft themselves, represented crucial strategic advantages throughout the Cold War competition. The development and deployment of these bombers also reflected deeper characteristics of American strategic culture: a preference for technological solutions to security challenges, comfort with massive engineering projects, and willingness to accept high financial costs to reduce human risk. The bomber programs absorbed enormous resources. The B-52 fleet alone cost more than $9 billion, 1950s dollars, to procure, but these expenditures were justified by the strategic flexibility they provided and the deterrent effect they generated. For the Soviet leadership, America's bomber capability represented not just a military threat, but an implicit challenge to their economic and technological claims. Soviet propaganda consistently proclaimed the superiority of their socialist system in generating technological progress, yet the visible reality of American aerospace achievement contradicted this narrative. The massive B-36 and the enduring B-52 stood as tangible evidence of Western capability that no amount of counter-propaganda could fully offset. Leonid Brezhnev, who led the Soviet Union from 1964 to 1982, reportedly expressed frustration over this disparity during a Politburo meeting in the 1970s. According to later accounts from participants, he complained, "We can match their missiles, we can match their submarines, but their bombers remain superior. Our designers promise equivalence with each new generation, yet it never materializes." This creates not just a military problem, but a perception problem in our competition for global influence. This perception battle extended to the developing world, where nations emerging from colonialism were choosing between Western and Soviet models of development and alignment. American technological achievements, from strategic bombers to the space program, provided powerful evidence for Western capabilities that influenced these choices. Nations seeking to develop their own aerospace industries typically looked to the United States rather than the Soviet Union for partnerships and technology transfer, recognizing the qualitative advantages demonstrated by American designs. The story of America's intercontinental bombers is thus more than a military history. It is an account of how technology shapes geopolitics, how engineering achievements influence international perceptions, and how weapon systems designed for one strategic environment can adapt to serve in radically different contexts. The B-36 Peacemaker and B-52 Stratofortress represent not just military platforms but embodiments of American strategic thinking, industrial capability, and technological innovation during a pivotal period in world history. As the Cold War receded into history, the legacy of these aircraft continued to influence international security arrangements. The concept of intercontinental power projection that they pioneered became a defining characteristic of American military posture, with global reach remaining a core capability across all service branches. The organizational culture of the Strategic Air Command, with its emphasis on readiness, reliability, and precise execution, established standards that permeated American military institutions long after SAC itself was disbanded in 1992. For the Russian Federation that emerged from the Soviet collapse, the memory of vulnerability to American bomber forces influenced their approach to air defense and strategic deterrence. Despite economic constraints, Russia maintained and modernized elements of the massive air defense network initially built to counter the bomber threat. Their own long-range aviation capabilities, particularly the modernized Tu-95MS and Tu-160 bombers, received continued investment even during periods of severe budget limitations, indicating the perceived importance of this strategic capability. The human dimension of the bomber story continued to evolve as well. Veterans of Strategic Air Command bomber operations, both flight crew and support personnel, carried their experiences into civilian life and other military roles. The distinctive culture they had developed, characterized by exacting standards, attention to detail, and unwavering commitment to mission accomplishment, influenced American corporate and institutional practices in subtle but significant ways. Many former bomber crew members went on to careers in commercial aviation, aerospace engineering, and other technical fields, bringing with them the skills and perspectives developed during their strategic deterrence service. For the airframes themselves, particularly the B-52, service continued long after the Cold War ended. The bomber that had been designed to counter Soviet expansionism found new purposes in the post-Soviet world, enforcing no-fly zones over Iraq, supporting NATO operations in the Balkans, and participating in the post-9/11 campaigns in Afghanistan and Iraq. The aircraft's adaptability allowed it to remain relevant even as the international security environment transformed completely. This continued relevance stemmed partly from modifications and upgrades that kept the B-52 compatible with evolving weapons, communication systems, and mission requirements. The original analog systems were gradually replaced with digital electronics. Conventional precision weapons capabilities were expanded dramatically. Communication systems were upgraded to ensure interoperability with other force elements in joint operations. The airframe that first flew in 1952 evolved into a network-centric platform capable of integrating with 21st century command and control systems. Colonel James Kowalski, who commanded B-52 operations during Operation Enduring Freedom, described this evolution. What makes the B-52 exceptional is not just its longevity, but its capacity for reinvention. The aircraft we fly today shares a basic airframe with the original design, but its internal systems, weapons capabilities, and operational concept have been completely transformed. It's like a ship of Theseus. So many components have been replaced and upgraded that it's both the same aircraft and an entirely new platform. This capacity for evolution ensures that the B-52 will continue, serving long after most of its contemporaries have been retired to museums. Current Air Force plans call for the bomber to remain in service until at least the 2050s, by which time the airframes will be approaching a century of operations, an unprecedented achievement in military aviation. New engines, avionics, and weapon systems will continue the process of evolution, maintaining the aircraft's relevance even as the strategic environment continues to change. The B-36, though long retired, left its own important legacy in aerospace engineering and strategic thinking. Its massive size demonstrated the feasibility of very large aircraft designs, influencing subsequent developments in both military and commercial aviation. Its intercontinental range established a baseline capability that became a standard requirement for strategic systems. Perhaps most importantly, it provided the crucial initial deterrent that maintained American strategic advantage during the vulnerable early years of the Cold War, when alternative delivery systems remained undeveloped. Together, these aircraft represent one of the most successful weapon system developments in military history, platforms that not only fulfilled their intended purpose, but shaped international relations, military doctrine, and technological development for decades. From the initial concept of a hemisphere defense weapon in 1941 to today's globally deployed force, the American Intercontinental Bomber Program stands as a testament to the capacity of technological innovation to overcome seemingly insurmountable strategic challenges. The story of these remarkable aircraft contains important lessons for contemporary security challenges. It demonstrates the value of designing systems with growth potential and adaptability, rather than optimizing exclusively for current requirements. It illustrates how military capabilities serve purposes beyond their direct combat function, influencing adversary perceptions and imposing costs through the countermeasures they necessitate. Perhaps most importantly, it shows how technological advantage can translate into strategic position, creating options for political leadership that would otherwise be unavailable. As modern great power competition intensifies, with new technologies like hypersonic weapons, autonomous systems, and space-based capabilities emerging as potential game changers, the history of America's intercontinental bombers offers valuable perspective. The strategic problems facing today's planners, how to project power across global distances, how to penetrate increasingly sophisticated defenses, how to maintain credible deterrence against peer competitors, echo the challenges that produced the B-36 and B-52 programs. The engineers, pilots, and strategists who developed America's intercontinental bomber capability confronted what seemed an impossible challenge: how to project decisive military power across thousands of miles against a continental adversary with sophisticated defenses. Their solution, aircraft of unprecedented size, range, and capability, fundamentally altered the strategic calculus of the Cold War, creating a capability that the Soviet Union could neither match nor effectively counter. This achievement reminds us that seemingly insurmountable strategic problems often yield to determined technological innovation and creative operational concepts. The impossible challenge of holding Soviet territory at risk from American bases was solved through a combination of engineering excellence, organizational determination, and strategic vision. The result was not just a weapon system, but a cornerstone of international stability during the most dangerous military confrontation in human history. Today, as the B-52 continues its remarkable service life, it stands as both a technological achievement and a symbol of strategic commitment. The aircraft that first took flight when Harry Truman was president has served through 14 presidential administrations, adapting to evolving threats and missions while maintaining its essential character as an instrument of American global reach. Few artifacts of the Cold War era remain as operationally relevant today. Fewer still are likely to continue serving decades into the future. For the crews who fly these aging but still formidable machines, there is a profound sense of connection to the generations who came before them. Lieutenant Colonel Michael Johnson, a current B-52 aircraft commander, expressed this sentiment. "When I climb into the cockpit, I'm aware that I'm taking control of an aircraft that carried my father's generation through the darkest days of the Cold War. The mission has changed. The weapons have evolved, but the fundamental purpose remains the same: to protect American interests and allies through global reach and power projection. It's a heritage we take very seriously. This continuation of purpose across generations reflects a deeper truth about strategic capabilities. They represent not just military assets, but expressions of national commitment and identity. The bombers that were created to counter Soviet expansion during the Cold War now serve as instruments of regional stability and global order maintenance in a very different world. Their adaptability to these changing circumstances stands as testament to both their physical design and the strategic vision they embody. As we look toward an uncertain future, with emerging powers developing their own long-range strike capabilities and advanced defensive systems, the lessons of America's intercontinental bomber programs remain relevant. The strategic advantages conferred by global reach, the deterrent effect of visible capability, and the diplomatic flexibility provided by recallable systems continue to influence international security calculations. The aircraft that the Soviets once couldn't believe existed have become enduring elements of the global security architecture, their influence extending far beyond their direct military function. The story of these extraordinary machines, from the massive B-36 Peacemaker to the enduring B-52 Stratofortress, remains one of the most remarkable chapters in the history of technology and strategy. By overcoming the geographic limitations that had constrained military power throughout previous centuries, they fundamentally altered the relationship between distance and security, creating a world where no nation, regardless of size or location, could consider itself beyond the reach of potential adversaries. This transformation of strategic reality, more than any specific military operation, constitutes their most profound and lasting legacy.